It's time for us to check back in with the history and stories of Opal Corn Myers. If you missed any of the previous readings, just look in the description below for a playlist. Building the Mission. In the fall of 1895, Miss Catherine Plants of Waterton, Wisconsin, stepped off the train in Bridgeport. I can just imagine how she must have felt. She had never before seen the likes of Back Mountain people, and here she was, all of about 22 or 23 years old, all by herself, looking around for someone who was supposed to meet her at the station, but no one showed up. Alone and confused, Catherine picked up her bags and walked over to the Bridgeport store. When she entered the store, she saw a half-dozen or so men sitting around a pot-bellied stove telling their tall tales. Some of them planted themselves in rocking chairs, while others leaned into straight-back chairs tilted backward on two legs. Each face held a respectable-sized plug of chewing tobacco. Why, those men probably thought they were dreaming when they looked over and saw this tall, attractive young lady with deep-set brown eyes. Her black hair was loosely drawn up into a soft mound on top of her head, and she was all gussied up in her fine store-bought clothes and fancy shoes. I reckon those men were just a-spitting all over each other, trying not to swallow that tobacco juice. The faces of the older men were stern with deep lines and creases. The younger ones just stared, not believing the wonders their eyes were seeing. "Excuse me, gentlemen, but I'm not sure that I got off at the right station." The sound of her northern brogue and the need to maintain their cuds brought them back from their fantasies. One healthy spit of tobacco juice, then another and another landed in the sandbox around the base of the stove. Some missed and landed on the already stained floor. Marion Fish spoke up. "Well, where are you heading for, young lady?" "A place back in the mountains somewhere outside of Del Rio. Someone was to meet me at the station there." She went on to tell him how earlier that year, a preacher from the area had gotten in touch with her about starting a Sunday school and an orphan's mission home and school for boys. "Del Rio's the next stop down yonder, about 6 or 7 miles. Reckon that's where you should have got off. There be a lot of folk talking about a mission out at Fairview, not far from my place. That being so, reckon you should have got off at the whistle stop. More'n likely, there be someone a-waitin' for you there. Tell you what," he continued, "you can come and stay with me and the missus for a spell. You can ride my mule. She's old, not much for comfort, but those shoes of yourn ain't going to get you far in these here mountains." Marion helped Miss Plants up on his old white mule and threw his turn of meal onto his shoulder. They started back over Yellow Mountain to his home near Fairview. One can only imagine the reactions of Marion's wife and other family members. Pure disbelief would be my guess. "Miss Plants, this here be my wife, Laura." "I'm so pleased to meet you, Laura. Please call me Katie." Katie found Laura to be as friendly and accepting as her husband. They took her in and treated her just like family. She remained with them through the winter, and in the spring, Katie moved into a vacant log cabin and busied herself fixing it up. Fred Odell now owns the cabin where Katie lived. Katie taught Sunday school at Fairview and helped out in the community. She would visit and nurse the sick, help with the young'uns, whatever she could do. All the people in the community took an instant liking to Miss Katie, especially Marion's daughters and their families. 3 of his daughters had married 3 of the Click brothers, Jack, France, and Hoss, and all of them lived just up a piece from Marion. It was the Click brothers who donated the 3 acres of land used for building the mission. Years later, more land would be purchased for the church. The building of Ebenezer Mission and its school was a community project, a huge task for these mountain people. Although everyone wanted to help, none of them had ever built anything other than log cabins and outbuildings, except maybe a barn or shed with wood planks. The mission was to be a large 3-story board structure with a basement. Trees would have to be cut and hauled or dragged to the mill a mile away, and then the boards brought back to the building site and dried out. None of the people there had ever heard tell of curing wood before building with it. Rocks would have to be selected and gathered for the foundation and basement walls. Another challenge would be finding the time to build. The fields had to be prepared to plant crops and gardens. Because of the abundance of steep hills and the lack of flat land, much of this work had to be done by hand with a hoe. Entire families were involved from sunrise to sunset in planting, weeding, and harvesting. Building the mission was going to take a while, but the people were excited and willing to work hard when time permitted. Katie had been corresponding all these months with a young Moravian preacher and former schoolmate, William H. Noaks, telling him about how accepting and appreciative the people were and keeping him informed of the progress she was making teaching Sunday school and helping in the community. William would soon be arriving to supervise the actual building of the mission. He also planned to establish new Sunday schools in the surrounding communities, like Pig Trot, during the times when the community people were too busy to help with the building. As the preparation started, Katie became more anxious, excited about more than the building of Ebenezer Mission. You see, William and Katie had been very close friends in school, and their separation had convinced them both that they were in love. When William finally arrived, it was a bit more than obvious that the two were indeed very good friends, not only sharing a love and concern for the well-being of the community, people, but also sharing a love for each other. Papa, who was already as big or bigger than most grown men, spent most of his spare time helping to build the mission house, often working side by side with William. He would laugh and tell us about how Katie and William would talk to each other in Latin when they were courting, so no one could understand what they were saying. But of course, everyone pretty well knew what kind of talking they were doing and enjoyed teasing them. "We're going to get us a teacher up here to teach us all that fancy talk." The people may not have understood the words, but they knew by the way those two talked and the way he treated her that they were in love. I guess you could say that was one time when Latin wasn't considered a dead language. In the book Christy, the students wanted to learn Latin because of their heritage, but it was really because of the Noaks. Of course, the other mission workers who came later had no way of knowing that. They just never would have thought that it was all because the people wanted to know what a fancy preacher man would be saying to the lady he loved. The young people had a great deal of respect for Miss Katie and William. By learning Latin, they could be more like them. It wasn't long before Katie and William slipped off to get married. They built a cabin close to the mission. It burned sometime later after the big mission house was built. While the construction was underway, months before the building was scheduled to be completed, Katie and William made several contacts to churches and individuals for help in furnishing the mission. When the final work was being done to the house, shipments of furniture and supplies began arriving in Del Rio. Wagon load after wagon load, for maybe 2 weeks or more, made their way 7 miles back up in the mountains over nearly non-existent roads to Ebenezer Mission. Papa said it was the most exciting part, helping the Click brothers, Jack, France, and Hoss, unload and move crates and furniture around as the women did the fancying up and planned who was going to make what for the gathering. The entire community had been invited to come see the mission. Marion Fish and his sons-in-law made tables out of planks laid across the empty moving crates and barrels for the food to sit on. That's how picnic tables were made back then. Nothing fancy to it. When the people started turning up, Marion and Laura helped Katie and William welcome everyone. One of Marion and Laura's daughters saw to it that the food was placed in the right spot, while the other two gave tours of the mission house. I have no idea how many showed up that hot summer afternoon, or what they thought when they stepped into the front room. I can imagine it, the sun casting long shadows as they opened the front door, the eager whispers and clicking footsteps on the wooden floor as they poured in. Everyone called it the big room. It was spacious, probably as large as 20 by 30 feet, about the size of some of the cabins up here. The dwelling house, as it was often called when I went to school at the mission, was heated by several potbelly stoves, all fired by logs. I would guess that's how it was always heated, because it had no fireplaces. The big room was used as both a meeting room and as a classroom. It was modestly furnished with long, functional benches against the walls that could be pulled out for the school classes, which consisted of Bible, catechism, reading, writing, and some math. From the big room, you passed into a large hall, which was about 10 feet wide. The kitchen, with a large pantry, and the dining room were on the other side of this hallway. Each of these two rooms was close to 14 by 16 feet in size. There was another outside entrance into the big hallway, as well as one into the kitchen. The cooking, however, was done in the basement of the mission house, and the food was sent to the main floor by way of a pulley-operated dumbwaiter located just off the kitchen by the pantry. The dirty dishes were returned to the basement in the dumbwaiter to be washed. The basement kitchen entrance was under the kitchen porch and could only be entered from the outside. There was a window in this kitchen through which food could be passed to people outside the house. The basement only had two big rooms, the kitchen, which had a wooden platform floor, and a storage room with a hard-packed dirt floor. There was a large staircase in the big hallway on the main floor, which had 13 steps, a landing, then 6 more steps leading to the second floor hallway. The layout of the second story was identical to the main floor. The big room there was used as the dormitory. One of the other rooms housed 2 of the mission workers, and the other room was used sometimes as an office and at other times for an additional staff bedroom. Sewing classes were offered for the community girls, while the boys helped William around the house and garden. Girls, however, were not admitted to the school until the church schoolhouse was built some years later. The third floor had only 2 rooms, both of which were large with slanted ceilings and used mainly for storage. The Noaks also started the Sunshine Band, a rough combination of daily vacation Bible school and Boy Scouts or 4-H. They would meet once a week to work on different projects, like helping the mission people raise garden crops. If one of the men in the community was sick, they might go over and hoe out his corn. They also took Bible courses, memorized scripture, and read books. They really learned a lot from the experience. The Sunshine Band ended shortly after the Noaks left. I would guess their successors offered something different. Some of the first boys to live in the mission home were Cleland and Uranus Rector, brothers from Madison County, North Carolina, and Mally and Frank Rigsby, whom I recollect were from Ohio. There were also Dallas and Cecil Giles, Wilbur Hall, Clarence Nelson, Hubert Henderson, and Charlie Hall, who was from the Edwina community of Cocke County, Tennessee. Nobody knows the details of why or the story behind it anymore, but Charlie Hall had been found with his mother, Morning Hall, who had run away from home with him. The bloodhounds that the authorities called in from Morristown found them up there on Hall Mountain. Charlie was taken to Ebenezer Mission, and Morning was sent to East Tennessee State Hospital in Knoxville, suffering from a nervous breakdown. There were probably at least 10 to 12 boys living at Ebenezer. Most of them were from the local and surrounding communities, but there were others from the Tennessee Valley area, as well as the Carolinas, Kentucky, and Ohio. Along with the increasing number of residents, the mission staff grew as well. In addition to Katie and William Nowak, there was Miss McWilliams, Mary Elkins, and Mary E. Godden. The boys were quite disciplined and unusually well behaved. The boarding school was structured so that the boys were kept busy all the time, leaving little room for mischief. Each boy had certain chores, some for the night and the next day. When they finished their work, they had freedom to meander through the countryside, talk to neighbors and friends, or play around the mission, but they were always supervised. Their daily routine was fairly strict. William established a Sunday school that met at the Pig Trot Schoolhouse on the other side of Yellow Spring Mountain. Being a well-liked man, the people there considered it a great honor when he and his boys spent Sunday dinner with them. The Harper home was one of his favorites. He felt that because of their rich family life, strong work ethics, and good manners, that the Harper boys were a positive influence for the boys from the orphanage. He even invited them to visit the mission, and I'm sure they took him up on the offer. The Noaks didn't stay as long as everyone would have liked. It was sad how it came to happen, but they had an infant son who died, leaving them childless. They buried his tiny box coffin by the mission house. The grave is still marked by a wall of stones. Not long after his death, they felt the Lord was calling them into foreign mission work, but not before their purpose was fulfilled here at Ebenezer. Before leaving to become missionaries to China, the Noaks placed each of the boys in other schools. The mission property was turned over to Dr. Edward O. Grant, founder and president of the American Inland Mission, also referred to as the Soul Winner Society, and editor of the Soul Winner. Grant, a teacher, was an officer in the Confederate Army attached to the headquarters of Confederate Generals Humphrey Marshall, William Preston, George Cosby, and John Hunt Morgan. During this time, he became aware of the spiritual and health needs of the mountain people. After the war in 1865, he entered medical college. He practiced medicine in Mount Sterling, Kentucky until 1873, when he decided to enter the ministry. Dr. Grant served as pastor to several Presbyterian congregations and as an evangelist for the Synod of Kentucky. The Noaks were pleased with what had been accomplished through the Ebenezer mission, but there was no way that they could have possibly known the long-term effects of the work they started. Generation after generation, their work continued to strengthen, encourage, and bring hope to our mountain cove and the communities that surrounded it. Most of the boys who stayed at the mission home while the Noaks were there became prominent leaders and businessmen. Charlie, the little boy whose mother was institutionalized, grew up and became an attorney in Ohio. The Rector brothers, who owned several boats and operated a fruit boat company on the Great Lakes, came back here several times to visit during their first years of retirement. After leaving Ebenezer to go to the international mission field, Mr. Noak continued to correspond with Neil, the youngest son of the Harper family, until about 1960. Mr. Noak died 4 years later at the ripe age of 90. The Noaks only made 4 trips back to the United States. Mrs. Noak died and was buried in China. Mr. Noak remarried some years after his wife's death. As late as 1975, his second wife was still living in a nursing home in Chicago. I don't know of anyone who has any recollections of what happened at Ebenezer Mission from the time the Presbyterian Soul Winners took over until around 1908. Right before they came in, sometime between 1902 and 1904, Papa's thoughts moved on to more than helping at the mission and his work at home. He was a young man at the time, and it was amidst all this change that his parents moved to a farm not more than a mile from Ebenezer. And we'll stop right there for today. Oh, so fascinating. All this whole book, it'll be like this. It's just so fascinating. Again, I thought of 2 or 3 things while I was reading that I didn't write down. And now I'm going to have to try to figure out what they were. One was about the men in the store when Catherine or Katie got off the train there at the wrong place. The image of them sitting around the stove, I'd wrote that part down, but the part I didn't was that the ones that were leaned back. I don't know if you've ever seen people do that, lean back in the straight back chairs like that. It's really, really common my whole life growing up to see people do that, whether it was at church, maybe on their porch, even in the house. So really, that was really something common that I would see very often. I was always afraid to do it myself, though, afraid it would slide out from under me. And of course, there was always a mother or a grandmother telling people don't to do that. You're going to fall, And I'm sure some people did fall. I think it's really interesting that she got off at the wrong place. But then it's like she got off at the right place, because Marion Fish and his wife Laura was there. You know, he took her home, and then Laura just welcomed her, and she fit right in. And it's kind of like it was meant to be like that. And then even by the time the mission was built, there they were part of the people that welcomed them. They were right with William and Katie. So it seems like it was an accident, but maybe one that was supposed to happen. It would have been, it's like Opal saying, you could just imagine, you know, the way she sounded and the way she dressed. Certainly the men, the older ones and the younger ones, would have been like, wow, who's this person and where did they come from? So it really would have been a big doings, I guess, if you would say, there. And when you think about those men sitting around the stove, there's still places like that. Especially before Pap died, a lot of men would gather at Clay's every morning, and they would sit around down there and they would talk and stuff, men that were retired. I even know there's, at our local McDonald's, there used to be a group of men that would meet every morning in the McDonald's there. And there's lots of different places like that. I'm sure even in your area you can think of places where people meet up every morning, drink their coffee and talk. And I guess a lot of, in a strange way, it's kind of like what I'm doing right now. Y'all are meeting up with me and we're talking. It's not in real life, but it's still got a, I guess, a strain of that going through it, of getting together and talking about things. So, because I always love for you to comment about the books that we read and talk about them. So that's really interesting. I love the part where she explains that William and Katie spoke Latin to each other. And it's interesting. That's why this book is so neat. And I'm so glad that Barbara did it. It was such a labor of love, but I think God wanted her to do it. I think it was really her calling. Because, like, that's one thing that nobody would have never known. They would have never realized, no, actually, the people there wanted to learn Latin not because they thought it was, you know, the language of their heritage, she says, but because William and Katie said it to each other, and they didn't know what they were saying, but they knew they were in love, you know. So I really love that little tidbit. Now, Granny took Latin in high school, so she used to say Latin sometimes, but that was when Granny was in high school. It was taught here in Cherokee County, Latin was. And I was talking about it being a big doings when she got off the train, but even this whole process, but especially as the mission got, you can just imagine when it first started out, maybe people were doubtful that it would really be built. Especially, she says, they had never built anything with dried wood, like with boards, and not on that scale. And so, you know, people would have been talking about that. And then when her daddy describes, Papa, she says, describes them bringing all the furniture in on the train and then having to haul it up there, you know, on really non-existent roads. You just know that would have been big doings for sure. That would have just been the talk of the whole area. And I imagine that the furniture was probably different than what the people there were used to. So that would just, every aspect of that would have just been excitement for everyone. I know it would have been. And really impressive to me is that they seem to all really like Katie and William. And this is, it happens both ways. Sometimes people come into an area to help people and they want to change everything about them, and then that rubs people wrong because they don't want everything to be changed, you know. So, but then sometimes people go to help and they actually say, we appreciate what you are. Like she had wrote William and said they're so appreciative and they're so kind and they're so helpful. So I think that probably enamored the people. That's why they become enamored with William and Katie, was because they took them as they were. They accepted them as they were. And sure, they wanted to teach them things. They wanted them to learn, but they wasn't trying to change who they were. So I thought that was really neat that they showed that much love for both of them, and were sad when they left. The picnic tables, talking about at the community event, we all used to, all of Pap's family, every year we would go to a little church near here, Bethel, and that was where in those days, my grandmother and great-grandmother was buried there, and then eventually my Papa Wade's buried there too now. But they would have homecoming or decoration day every year, and we would go, a little bitty church, and there'd be preaching and there'd be singing, but there'd be dinner on the grounds, and that's how they did. It was just like stuff with boards laid on top of things. It wasn't, sometimes you might see at a church, if it's one that has dinner on the grounds a lot, they might have like a big row of picnic tables, or maybe some tables under a pavilion that are all built. It wasn't like that. It was more just boards laid on top of stuff. And Some good food at those tables, though, so I love that. And love that I can remember a place like that. That's kind of nice, too. As I said, it was really sad when the Noaks left because of the death of their infant there. That would have been terrible, and you can imagine that they wanted to maybe a change, but then they said the Lord led them, and apparently, I mean, they only come back to the United States 4 times, and he lived to be 90, so they spent the rest of their life, overseas being missionaries. That's really admirable, and again, shows what wonderful people they were. And I don't know that they could have known that. Maybe they could have knew some of it, since it says, at least he could have, William, because it says he stayed in contact with Neil till 1960. But then she goes through all the success stories of all those first group of boys that were there. Really impressive to think about how Katie and William played a role in, that community, changing it, maybe whether it was, teaching them, whether it was about the Lord, that'd be the most important thing, or maybe health things, or maybe a better way to do something, or teaching them to read, whatever it was. But then knowing that what they taught those boys and the influence they had on them, then they took that to other places. So in turn, that affected other communities. The one that talked about the Great Lakes, the brothers that went up there, the one that went to Ohio. So their little seeds that they planted sprouted and grew in lots of different directions. And life is like that. We don't always realize it, but something that we say or do to somebody, it may impact them for the rest of their life, and maybe we'll never know about it. Maybe 20 years later somebody will tell us about it. I know there were several ball players that Pap, he was a baseball coach. He kind of coached Paul up through till he got to high school. He didn't coach in high school, but up through from even Little League, the majors, the minors, the majors, all the way up. And he did the same for Steve. So over those years, that's lots of different boys he was, come in contact with. And sometimes, after they were grown, some of those boys they'd call Pap, or they'd come back and tell him what his influence meant to him. And that's really touching. And of course, when Pap was coaching them, he was just coaching baseball, but along that, of course, you're going to pick up stuff, and probably the way he treated them and all that really impacted them. And I'm sure he talked to them sometimes about life stuff, but he probably never thought about it, what he was doing. He was just being him, being sincere and being good and decent, and it certainly impacted them in the same way that sounds like William and Katie impacted these boys. I hope you enjoyed this part. Please leave a comment and tell me what jumped out at you, or what you wondered about, or what you liked. And I hope you'll drop back by next Friday so we can see what happens with Opal next.